I take it that this announcement means that you're not going to be mounting a bid for president yourself.
That is correct.
Why?
My best value add to this campaign, to this primary, is making certain that whomever the nominee is, that we have a fair fight in 2020, and that's what I'm going to focus on. Part of my responsibility as a citizen and as someone who has the opportunity to stand for the highest office is to make certain that I'm the right person and it's the right time. But it's also to make sure that I'm doing the best that I can do to ensure that we have someone who beats Donald Trump and that we win back the Senate. And as I looked at the candidates, as I watched the debates, I think we have a robust crop of candidates who have thoughtful ideas and plans for how we move our country forward. And so for me, the decision was, how can I best be of service?
That was one of the Democratic stars of the 2018 election cycle, Stacey Abrams, who was a point and a half away from a monumental upset in the state of Georgia in their governor's race. She made it official on Rachel Maddow last night that she won't be a late entrant into the 2020 presidential contest, despite many calls for her to do so. Instead, choosing to focus on fighting voter suppression. She did, however, reveal to the New York Times that she'd be honored to be considered for vice president by any nominee. Abrams isn't the only 2018 star to experience that palpable buzz. It's what Beto O'Rourke experienced in Texas when he ran against Ted Cruz. But Beto's going the other way, going all in on his presidential effort. O'Rourke is set to deliver a reset speech from his hometown of El Paso tomorrow that follows taking last week off to respond to the tragedy in his hometown. Joining our conversation, Eddie Glaude, chair of the Center for African American Studies at Princeton University. You were my wingman last week. I'd say you stole the show. I was happy to give it to you. But we've covered Beto last week. I mean, he was the voice of his town's pain. He was the voice connecting Donald Trump's rhetoric to the violent massacre at Walmart. And he was the first voice in that field of 2020 Democratic candidates to just say out loud, but I've heard a lot of people say, frankly, in both parties, that Donald Trump certainly walks and talks and sounds and therefore must be a white supremacist.
Right. I mean, I think Beto demonstrated very clearly that there is a substantive judgment among a large number of Americans that Donald Trump is a toxic force in our body politic. Remember the excitement around Joe Biden's announcement that he linked explicitly Donald Trump to Charlottesville, and people were like, that's powerful. So folks are open and are open to the truth. They want folk to just simply say what Donald Trump is. And Beto is good at that, but you just can't do that. You also have to lay out substantive policies about what you are going to do. How are you going to, in some ways, change the direction of the country? So it's not just simply about naming Donald Trump or describing what Donald Trump is and what he's doing. It's also about what are you going to do to change the circumstances of everyday ordinary people. And what I love about what Stacey Abrams said, I wish many of the other candidates would just decide to serve, understand what would be their best lane, and understand that the problem that we face as a country extends beyond just simply the White House. We need folks in every area, in every domain.
We also need somebody in the Georgia Senate. So, I mean, I kind of wish, she could do what she's doing, and also she could run against Senator Perdue in Georgia. and maybe, just because I think she'd be a great senator, I also think her presence on the ticket would help put Georgia in play. But I understand what she's doing, and it couldn't be a more important project. I mean, participation, the ability to participate is the fault line, the major fault line.
If someone had done what she was doing, she probably would be governor now.
Exactly.
Ron Klain, I want to get you on these two 2020 stories, and then also on Eddie's broader point about I think I think there's the Democratic primary contest as it was before El Paso, and I think there's a Democratic primary contest as it is now post El Paso, and I wonder if you agree.
I do. I mean, I want to go back to Stacey Abrams for just 1 second. I think there's been a lot of talk about what she's not doing, not running for president, not running for Senate. But we got to take a second to talk about what she is doing. Fairfight.com, Fair Fight, the organization she's building, is a critical element of what it's going to take to defeat Donald Trump in 2020. If we don't reverse the kind of voter suppression we've seen all over the country, the closing of polling places, the purging of voter rolls, the various efforts to keep people who have a lawful right to vote from voting, then, you know, our democracy really isn't going to live up to its name, and Donald Trump's going to vote suppress his way to a second term. So I think what she's doing is critically important. She's a great leader for that fight. The organization she's put together is exceptional. I know people will check out fairfight.com and learn more about what Stacey's doing. I do think that El Paso is a turning point. I mean, sadly, we've had too many of these incidents, but the combination of the toxic anti-immigrant hatred fueled by Trump and his rhetoric and this continued problem of mass shootings fueled by the NRA's control over our politics is really coming together to shape what voters want to see the next president address. And I think, you know, obviously I'm a Biden supporter. I worked for Vice President Biden. I'm you know, on his team. I think he's made some powerful statements about this the past few days. Others have as well. I think Congressman O'Rourke obviously spoke to it powerfully. But, I mean, this is issue number one right now in the Democratic Party, and it should be in the country, too. And I think seeing candidates step up and address that's very important.
Ron, it could be the beginning of any joke. Two political operatives walk into a bar, but that's how I feel whenever you come on. So just political operative to political operative. I watched Ken Cuccinelli really debase the language on the Statue of Liberty by saying, you know, don't give me your poor, you know, only people who can support themselves from Europe. I mean, his statements about treating legal immigrants the way the Trump administration envisions to treat them sort of got worse as the day went on yesterday, and I don't want to amplify any of his bigotry or hatred, but I think everyone saw the story. We covered it here yesterday. I want to ask you, though, how you knit this together. I mean, it seems to me if I were an operative working for the Democratic Party, which I've never been and can't imagine ever being, but I would take all of the structures around the war against terrorism, which united all Americans. The Patriot Act passed, I think, 99 to, you know, that was a moment of national unity. And if we really believe, as Donald Trump's handpicked FBI director, Chris Wray, said, that the greatest threat to the homeland is white supremacist-inspired domestic terrorism, or at least that it's on the rise, how do Democrats tie that threat to national security to the president's rhetoric?
Look, hatred and division is the number one threat to Americans' domestic security. It is what is fueling mass shootings. It is what that hatred and division, powered also with assault weapons, is what makes us scared every morning when our children go off to school. It's what makes us scared when our kids go to concerts or when we go shopping in Walmarts or whatever. And I think that, Democrats should definitely speak about it. It's time for Republicans to speak up about it, too, and to make the case that we are living in a country that is needlessly at risk, that is needlessly in danger because we are being threatened by a force here in our own country that the president fuels every day and that the NRA refuses to allow us to address. And I think if we can step up and tackle those things, we can make the country a safer place.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.